Recording in progress. Okay. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about perhaps the most interesting ideas, at least to modern people, about God. This is the fifth of 5 sessions of this year's Lunch and Learn on God and how we understand God, and some ways of the point being, of course, to give you more language, more ways of thinking about God, to perhaps make it easier for all of us to wrap our heads around the concept, which is, of course, so much more complicated for modern people than it was for our ancient ancestors. So hence, in my mind, the need for this discussion. We have covered, of course, up till now, visions of God from the Tanakh, ideas from Talmud and Midrash, rabbinic literature, medieval conceptions. The last session we did was about the early modern thinkers, people like Rabbi Isaac Luria, Baruch Spinoza, Moses Mendelssohn. We talked about Hermann Cohen, who will sort of make a brief appearance today as well. And today we're actually really talking about the 20th century, the 20th century being, I think, perhaps still relevant here in the early 21st century, but in particular, the ideas that came to the fore in the Jewish world in the 20th century are in my mind, really important for how we as contemporary Jews understand God. We'll be talking today about Martin Buber, Franz Rosenzweig. We'll be talking about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan. Buber and Rosenzweig in some ways kind of go together, and so too do Heschel and Kaplan. So we'll be looking at all of those folks. I would usually show the timeline at this point, but since we all kind of remember the 20th century, I think, Maddie, do you remember the 20th century? So most of us remember the 20th century. Quite well. I myself am a product of the 20th century, and so I'm not going to bother with the timeline, but we'll as we go through these characters, you will see that their ideas are really, I think, quite relevant to contemporary Jews. Let me put a little asterisk there, which is that I think that most people don't think too deeply about God. You know, I probably said that at the outset. Most of us sort of take God as what you might call a postulate, or perhaps something that you can either accept or deny, and not much more than that. Most of us in the Jewish world certainly don't think about God as adults in any sort of deep way, because, you know, we're not spending a lot of time with contemporary philosophers or studying Talmud for that matter. But I think it's something that we cannot let go of, even though in some sense you can say that Judaism is more focused on practice than it is on belief, and therefore what you believe about God is not so important. It's still, I think, helpful to modern people living in the world that we do, for us to have something that we can ideally latch onto. So hence the reason for this series of Lunch and Learns. And I hope, by the way, that I know that many of the people here have been to many of these sessions. I hope that some of this has been helpful. I want to remind everybody that here I'm going to put up all of the previous sessions are available via YouTube, and I think you can find them at the link on the Beth Shalom website. You could probably also find them on the Beth Shalom YouTube channel, for what that's worth. So if you want to go back and see what we said previously, you can check there. So then with that out of the way, that housekeeping, we're going to go straight into Dr. Martin Buber. Buber was born in 1878 in Vienna, and spent much of his time. He grew up primarily in Lviv, which is, of course, in Ukraine. When I was a kid, they referred to it as Lvov, but of course, you know, that the preferred Ukrainian name now is Lviv. Family was well steeped in Jewish tradition. They were Orthodox. His grandfather was Solomon Buber, who was a scholar of Midrash, who you can still find the Buber edited Midrash volumes out there. And he's also a descendant of a well-known 16th century halachic interpreter, Rabbi Meir Katzenellenbogen, who is also known as the Maharam, and you might see that name pop in and out. So he comes from this very traditional, very religious, rabbinic family, you might say, but ultimately he goes to university in Vienna and he studies Western philosophy, Kant and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, etc. He is swept up in the sort of the Zionist fervor of at the very beginning of the 20th century, and is a Zionist, even though he teaches in Germany for many years, before actually fleeing to Israel in 1938 when he became a professor at the Hebrew University. And he continued to teach, by the way, until close to the end of his life. He died in 1965 in Jerusalem. One of my teachers from the Jewish Theological Seminary, Rabbi Ed Feld, once when he was in rabbinical school, or maybe studying at Hebrew U prior to that, he said he was in Jerusalem, and he somehow got a hold of Martin Buber's phone number and called Martin Buber's house, and Martin Buber himself picked up the phone and said, "Martin Buber Khan," and spoke to Dr. Buber about some essential matter of Jewish philosophy. Buber's most famous work, and the one we're going to talk about, and the one that is most relevant to us regarding the ideas surrounding God, is, of course, what's called in German Ich und Du, which is generally translated into English as I and thou, and deliberately it has to be thou and not you, even though, of course, we don't use the word thou anymore. It sounds sort of old for us. But thou in English is, of course, the informal you. All of most European languages have an informal you. Like if you think in French, you would use vous instead of tu, in Spanish, it's usted versus tu. They all have informal you. Sorry, the other way around. Tu versus usted, etc. Yeah, the informal you, tu in French or tu in Spanish, is thou in English. And there's a reason why Buber is referring to, he's using the German du, meaning thou. Why informal? Because the thou is much closer to you. I'll explain what that means in a moment. But it has to be thou and not you. And it also, of course, and Buber also in describing the primary relationship words, that's what he calls this. There's I thou versus I it. It being something, a relationship between you and something that is completely conditional. So a chair is always an it, because you know that you can sit on the chair, and the chair has a specific role. You expect that the chair is going to support you when you sit on it. So it is always an it, and your relationship with the chair is an I-it relationship. Your relationship with people very close to you can be sometimes an I-thou relationship, meaning that you are so close that there are no particular conditions put on that relationship. And what's really essential, the essential takeaway for Buber regarding God, is that God is the eternal thou. That all of us have this I-thou relationship with God, and God can never have any conditions put on God at all. That is to say, our relationship with God is entirely unconditional, entirely, therefore, so undescribable. There's nothing that you can say, because once you start to describe it, of course, you're putting conditions. Like, well, when you say God controls the weather, or God protects us from harm, or whatever, then immediately you're putting these conditions on God. God has this certain role. But Buber said, no, actually, God is completely, eternally unconditional. God is the essential, eternal thou. And we're going to read a little bit from I and thou in just a moment. Buber is probably most popular amongst Reform rabbis because really all that's important in Buber's mind is this relationship with this relationship with God, this I-thou relationship, with this completely unconditional, eternal thou. And therefore, halacha, or revelation, everything that comes from that is only based in the experience of those who that record that we have, that is called the Torah, that includes the story of Revelation and the halacha, the law that comes from that was only for those people who had that relationship, and therefore no longer applies to us. Something that's great for the Reform movement, because they elevate your personal autonomy in halacha versus actually fulfilling a specific set of laws that the conservative movement and orthodoxy still adhere to. So Buber is a favorite in particular of the Reform movement. But Buber was also known, by the way, for Hasidic stories, for collections of Hasidic stories. What's interesting about Buber's collections is that he leaves out the halachic message at the end. You know, there's a story, and then there's some kind of like moral, like thou shalt do this because of this story, and Buber just cut that stuff out. Eileen, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Considering what we talked about last week about God's gender, can thou be considered a gender neutral term?
So I would say in English, thou is definitely a gender neutral. There's no gender attached to it. In some languages there would be. I don't speak German, so I don't know if du is a masculine or feminine. But I would guess. I don't know. I don't speak German. but yeah, I mean, I think that because of that unconditional, gender is a condition, right? If you have an expectation about the gender of somebody, that's a condition that you're setting on. Buber would certainly say, if Buber were here, which he is not, he would certainly say, of course, God has no gender because God has no conditions whatsoever. So, so good question. Thank you for that.
Oh, I just wanted to tell you one thing. Yesterday, I had an inquiry from a friend, a non-Jewish friend, who wanted to know if there was a feminine equivalent of the word mensch in Hebrew. And I said, no, it's a gender neutral. It can be a good person, masculine or feminine. No?
So mensch is Yiddish, that's clearly masculine because it actually literally means man. In Hebrew, there are no nouns that are without gender. So that's a whole question that we can't get into right now. But
Okay.
actually, the question of gender and language is a thorny one that we don't really have time to unpack. But thank you. I'll tell you what, I'm going to throw up a piece from I and Thou right here, so we can take a look at that. Can everybody see that? If you can see that, wave your hand. Okay, I know it's small here. If I make it a little bigger like that, does that help? Is that better? Okay, so I need a vote. Eileen, since you're unmuted there, would you be willing to read for us, beginning the top there, the thou meets me? Can you see it? You're muted. You're muted. You're muted. We can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Okay. All right, here we are. Okay.
Yep.
The thou meets me through grace. It is not found by seeking, but my speaking of the primary word to it is an act of my being, is indeed the act of my being, the act of my being.
When he says my speaking of the primary word, when Buber says speaking the primary word, I thou is that primary word, and he doesn't really mean literally speaking. He means experiencing, I think, is the best way of understanding that. So I experience God as in this fundamentally unconditional I thou relationship. Go on.
The thou meets me, but I step in direct relation with it. Hence, the relation means being chosen and choosing, suffering and action in one, just as any action of the whole being, which means the suspension of all partial actions and consequently of all sensations of actions, grounded only in their particular limitation, is bound to resemble suffering. The primary I thou can be spoken only with the whole being. Concentration and fusion into the whole being can never take place through my agency, nor can it ever take place without me. I become through my relation to the thou, as I become I say thou. All real living is meeting.
Actually, I know this is a little ethereal. Read the next one, and then it will just comment on this a little bit. Go on.
Okay. The relation to the thou is direct. No system of ideas, no foreknowledge, and no fancy intervene between I and thou. The memory itself is transformed as it plunges out of its isolation into the unity of the whole. No aim, no lust, and no anticipation intervene between I and thou. Desire itself is transformed as it plunges out of its dream into the appearance. Every means is an obstacle. Only when every means has collapsed, does the meeting come about.
Okay. So what I think that Buber is saying, and again, I find this fascinating. It's a wonderful idea, that God as this eternal thou, that God is just there. There's no connection, there's no there's no ideas about about what the interchange is. It's just current, constant, direct relationship. No ideas can be attached to it, no conditions, obviously. Nothing that we think about God really applies. What matters is just that we are here and we have this sort of instant, constant, direct relationship with God. And that means, by the way, that revelation, which we can call Torah, that revelation, or whatever it means for Buber, that just comes to us directly without any kind of intermediary. Torah, the written book, and of course interpretation, that's all human. That doesn't really come from God. What essentially comes from God is just that immediate, direct connection. I see, Pat, I think you have a question.
Yes, I think I was immediately struck by the word grace, which I think of as being, I always think of that as being a quintessentially Christian word.
Yeah. So grace is actually not exclusively a Christian idea. It's just that Jews and Christians think about it differently. Grace literally means favor in Hebrew. The word actually, you might have heard the word. The word is chen in Hebrew, and you meet like Israelis named Chen or Chana. Actually, the name Chana is actually also derived from my daughter's name is Grace. Although again, that sounds very Christian. But yes, grace meaning this sort of immediate connection between us and God. Again, Christians have a different idea. It's like an essential part of their theology, which it isn't really for Jews. But Buber's using it, this idea of God's favor for us, and our God's connection, if you will, to us. Even though there are no good words here because it's by definition not definable. So thank you. Any questions or reactions to this text? Again, I know I said like some of it is sort of up there, but any thoughts? I'll tell you what. Let's move. I got another Buber text here from further on in I and Thou. Can you all see that? What is eternal? What is the eternal primal phenomenon? Yes. Okay. No. You can't see it. No. Oh wait. No. Oh, wait, hold on. I did it the wrong way. Hold on. I got to do that through screen share. I'm sorry.
I think you have to stop share and then share again.
Oh, I have stop share and then share again. Okay, so right. So share screen. Thank you. Thank you for the tech help. So let's try this. How about that one? All right. And it should be there now. See that now?
Coming.
Great. Yes. Okay, Rich, I see your next. Could you read for us? What is the eternal primal phenomenon?
Sure. What is the eternal primal phenomenon present here and now of that which we term revelation? It is
by the way, okay, if revelation sounds Christian, that's because it's the name of a book in the Christian Bible, but revelation is another word for Torah. It's what God gives us. Revelation. Go on.
Yeah. It is the phenomenon that a man does not pass from the moment of the supreme meeting, the same being as he entered into it. The moment of meeting is not an experience that stirs in the receptive soul and grows to perfect blessedness. Rather, in that moment, something happens to the man. At times, it is like a light breath, at times like a wrestling bout, but always it happens. The man who emerges from the act of pure relation that so involves his being has now in his being something more that has grown in him, of which he did not know before and whose origin he is not rightly able to indicate. Okay,
hold up there for a second. So what Buber is talking about here is actually the Mount Sinai moment. That, although except for Buber, Sinai is all the time. Okay, what happens in the Torah story? Mount Sinai, Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, talks to God, gets a whole bunch of Torah and comes down, right? Buber says, well, that happens, except it didn't happen at Mount Sinai. It just happens all the time, very subtly, that we're constantly receiving this kind of direct transmission from God. And that the unconditionality of our relationship is such that we are constantly in contact with God, and that God is just there changing us, and we are changing God in this immediate, he describes it as a wrestling bout. Right? It just happens. Revelation is constant, continuous, and it is essential to who we are. We're getting it whether we like it or not. Okay. Mount Sinai, that was an interesting story. But really what's going on in our relationship with God is that it just happens through this unconditional direct contact. Okay. Any observation? What might that mean for us as human beings, according to Buber? Does it mean that that we have to act a certain way? Does it mean that we? And again, I'm not going to. We don't necessarily have to answer these questions, but certainly Buber wants us to think about, if we are constantly in touch with God, don't we have this sort of innate, fundamental holiness that belongs to all of us, right? That ideally will guide us to act in the right way, in the holy way, the God that wants. What does that mean then, of course, for the people who misbehave? I'm not sure. Yes, Eileen, what's your question?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think all of this can be condensed, I think, for whatever it's worth, it can be condensed that our existence and the existence of God is as natural and an ongoing process as breathing.
I think that's, even breathing is too much, I think, for Buber. I think even breath is too much of a physical description of what this is. But yes, it's just a part of who we are, you might say.
Yeah, and when you talk about God transmitting energy to us, I think it's a back and forth process. It's not, we give and we get. Yep. And it's I don't know that you can label it or do anything more elaborate than that.
Absolutely. Maddie, did you want to add something about that?
Yeah, well, it might be unrelated to that, but just about so it sounds like there's this sort of baseline that God is giving to every person, but does it matter the amount to which the human reciprocates that, or the intentionality in that relationship? That's what I'm thinking about.
It's not clear. Buber doesn't really think that there are any, again, no conditions on this relationship at all. So I don't know. I don't know. It's interesting. I mentioned that Buber was a Zionist. He obviously he feels strongly culturally about the Jews moving to Israel. I don't know if he would say that has anything to do with God, for example. Which is an interesting thought. Maybe he only thought of it from the perspective of peoplehood. I'll tell you what, we have a lot to cover. I think that we probably got a sense of what Buber teaches with respect to God. I'm gonna cut that there, and we're gonna move on to Rosenzweig. I'll put up. I got some Rosenzweig stuff here. That's not the one that I want. Sorry, there it is. Okay. So Rosenzweig is, he and Buber are pretty much exact contemporaries. Rosenzweig is born in 1886 in Germany. He dies quite young. He actually died of Lou Gehrig's disease. He was only, I think, 53, died in 1929. He came from this minimally religious family. And in fact, he's sort of famous for, one of the famous stories about Rosenzweig is that he was going to convert to Christianity. He writes a letter to one of his cousins saying, I'm going to convert to Christianity. And then he, because at that time it was a perfectly reasonable thing to do to move ahead in your career. I mean, he was studying philosophy. He was a teacher, and he didn't have any need for Judaism, and so but he gives Judaism one more chance, and he goes to synagogue for Kol Nidre, and on Yom Kippur, and he's sort of struck by how rich and powerful the experience is, that he decides, I can't leave this, and instead turns to teaching Jewish philosophy, and in fact, he becomes one of the founders of the famous Lehrhaus, the learning house in Frankfurt in 1920, and the Lehrhaus being sort of this center of learning, of not a university per se, but it was sort of like this salon, if you will, where there were all these great teachers who taught at the time, and so he ultimately writes a his most famous work is called The Star of Redemption, published in 1921. And it's got a kind of a gimmick about it that's related to God, people, and the world, and creation, revelation, redemption, making 6 points of the Magen David, of the 6-pointed star. Not so important, but his ideas about God is that, similar to Buber, we are in constant relationship, and this idea of continuous revelation is very much a part of Rosenzweig's idea as well. For Rosenzweig, our relationship with God is deeply personal. That however we react to God in love, God identifies God's self to us in love, and we respond in love. And in that individual relationship, we are called to this sense of commandedness. For Rosenzweig, is important for us, even if the content of revelation is not, what's in the Torah might have been for the ancient people, wasn't necessarily for us. Nonetheless, there is this sense of mitzvah, of being commanded and responding. Now, what Rosenzweig said we would be commanded to do might not be exactly what traditional Judaism has said. Nonetheless, we are commanded, and that comes through this loving relationship with God. I mentioned the one story about almost converting to Christianity. The other very famous story about Rosenzweig is that he is he's a Baal Tshuva, right? He comes back to Jewish practice, and some point he's in some kind. This is an apocryphal story. I don't know if this is actually written down anywhere, but everybody knows it about Rosenzweig, that he was once asked by some guy, so Herr Rosenzweig, now that you are religious again, are you putting on tefillin every day? And what was Rosenzweig's answer? Not yet. Not yet. And Rosenzweig's answer, of course, is something that I think that many Jews today can very much relate to. This idea, well, I don't put on tefillin every day, even though I know that I am commanded to do so. But until I really feel that level of commandedness within my relationship with God, I'm not ready to do it yet. So I'm still working on it. And many of us, I think, in our Jewish journeys are still working on that. Rosenzweig, in many ways, is perhaps one of the more influential philosophers for the conservative movement in particular, because of the way we understand our relationship with halacha. The idea of mitzvah and commandedness, of course, being very important to us. So Rosenzweig, could I get involved? Who's next? Actually, Maddie, you haven't read. Would you read for us All That God Ever Reveals? Since you're...
All that God ever reveals in Revelation is revelation. Or to express it differently, God reveals nothing but God's self to humanity. The relation of this accusative and dative to each other is the one and only content of Revelation.
To understand, by the way, accusative and dative, you had to have studied inflected languages like German or Latin, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. Go on. Go ahead.
Whatever does not follow directly from this covenant between God and humanity, whatever cannot prove its direct bearing on this covenant, cannot be a part of it. The problem has not been solved for the visionary who beheld the vision. It has been dissolved.
So again, the essence of for Rosenzweig is this individual relationship. And I think that's when he's talking about covenant here. What flows in our Jewish practice from this relationship is sort of is an individual choice that is based on that loving relationship. When he says the problem has not been solved for the visionary who beheld the vision, it has been dissolved. I think what he is saying is that ultimately every vision for anybody else is not necessarily our vision. It is up to the individual to understand their own personal relationship and what that requires of them. I have another piece of from Rosenzweig. Hold on, let me put that one up. This is okay. This is from a letter. This is actually, I think, helpful and more so with respect to God and understanding. This is from a personal letter that he wrote to some of his students at the Lair House. Who hasn't read? Can I get? Oh, Alva, would you read? Am I thinking about this? Can you see?
Mute. Okay. In my thinking about this, another differentiation occurred to me. The differentiation between what can be stated about God and what can be experienced about God. What can be stated objectively is only the very general formula, God exists.
Again, that's even more than Buber would say. I mean, existence being a kind of condition, right? Rosenzweig, by the way, is, even though he predates sort of what we think of as the existentialists, which was really the philosophers of the middle of the 20th century, early middle 20th century. But he is related to them, this idea of questions of existence and meaning. So God exists is very much sort of in that vein. That's all we can say about God. We don't know what God is or how to describe God, but God exists. Please go on.
Experience, however, goes much further. What we can thus state or even prove about God is related to our possible experience, in the same way that the empty announcement that two persons have married or the showing of the marriage certificate is related to the daily and hourly reality of this marriage. The reality cannot be communicated to a third person. It is no one's concern, and yet it is the only thing that counts. And the objective statement of the fact of marriage would be meaningless without this most private, incommunicable reality. And so, even the bare fact of marriage does not become real, save where it leaves the sphere of what can be objectively stated and enters the secret pale of the festive days and anniversaries of private life.
Right. So I think what he is saying there, he uses the marriage metaphor is actually a very good one. Okay, two people are married. Fine. That's like saying God exists. This marriage exists. Okay. But the experience of what takes place in that marriage is really only between those two people. So God exists for all of us, but what's going on in our individual relationships with God is deeply personal and cannot be understood by anybody except the people in that relationship, i.e., you and God. And so it is similar to Buber a little bit more, I would say, in the realm of this. There's a little bit more of this conditionality about God's existence and our commandedness within that relationship. Again, where they might agree is that it's not clear what the specifics of our obligations are in that relationship. He goes on a little more to express. He talks a little bit about the thou, but I think we're going to move on because time just gets away from us so quickly. And there's so much material here. Any reactions to Rosenzweig? Is this the first time that most of us have encountered Rosenzweig? I think Buber is probably more well known. Rosenzweig is, I would say, harder to understand in my experience, and so again, I'm trying to sort of pair them off each other. By the way, they collaborated to write a German translation of the Tanakh based on sort of their philosophical principles that they did not complete because I think they only got up to Isaiah before Rosenzweig died, and Buber continued working on it when he was in Israel at Hebrew U. But they were close, and they were similar in philosophies, except for the fact that, well, Rosenzweig was not a Zionist the way that Buber was, but also that Rosenzweig latched onto this idea of commandedness. That was an important principle to him, which I don't think that Buber agreed with. So there's Rosenzweig. Any questions or observations about that? Yeah, go ahead, Eileen.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, that marriage is, they talk about marriage and how holy it is and how important it is. And I just imagine that marriage is holy in the sense that it metaphorically returns us to our primeval state of the dual gender entity made at creation.
Right. There's that certainly sits well within Jewish tradition, and there's certainly a sense of actually the Tanakh, of course, uses the image of marriage between God and Israel frequently. I mean, perhaps the best example is the prophet Hosea, who talks about his failed marriage because God is the male partner and Israel is the female partner who has strayed. That also is something that Ezekiel uses as well. But yes, that's certainly that Rosenzweig is, I think, using that metaphor because of its deep connection in Jewish life. Thank you. Let's move on to we're going to talk a little bit about Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan. Let me find the passage. So Rabbi Kaplan is probably best known for being the founder of Reconstruction. Oh wait, I did the wrong thing again. I got to actually share it. Hold on. Rabbi Kaplan is best known as the founder of Reconstructionism, and although it's not clear that Kaplan actually meant to create a new to create a movement. That is ultimately what happened. But he wrote some books, and he wrote a couple of Sidurim. Kaplan and Reconstructionism sort of flowed from that. He was born in 1881 in Lithuania. He ultimately immigrates to the United States with his family when he's quite young. He was ordained as a rabbi at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1902. Which is actually pretty early. He was only 21. I think he started in those days. You could actually start at JTS to study for ordination even before you had finished your undergraduate degree. So he was also studying at the City College of New York and Columbia. He studied philosophy and sociology. And in 1902, the conservative movement had not really crystallized. It's not until Solomon Schechter's reforms from some years later that actually becomes officially conservative. So he initially identifies as an Orthodox rabbi, and he has a couple of pulpits in Orthodox synagogues. He founds the Jewish Center, which is an Orthodox synagogue in New York. Today, it's a normal modern Orthodox shul, but it was the first when Kaplan founded it in 1922. He felt like he wanted to create the synagogue as this community center. That's why it's called a Jewish center and not a synagogue. It was the first shul with a pool. That's a model that was very popular at a certain time. Beth Shalom, for example, has a gym. I don't think there's a pool here, or if there is, I haven't seen it. But there were many synagogues that had workout rooms and whatever, because that was Kaplan's vision. Actually, Kaplan was very much an activist in the sense of he created institutions. He wrote Sidurim, as I said. He founded. So when he left the Jewish Center because he felt Orthodoxy was not ready to move fast enough the way that he wanted to move. So he founded the Society for the Advancement of Judaism a block away on 86th Street in Manhattan a few years later. And that became the first Reconstructionist synagogue, and it is still functioning today as a Reconstructionist synagogue. It was the place, by the way, where his daughter Judith was called to the Torah as a bat mitzvah and read from the Torah in 1922. Sorry, did I say that he founded the Jewish Center is a few years before that? 1922 is when he founded SAJ. And the same year he called his daughter the Torah. And that was 101 years ago, almost this week, in fact. And so he taught at JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, for over 50 years. He loved teaching rabbis. He was very popular, had a tremendous impact on the conservative rabbinate. Most conservative rabbis are really Reconstructionists. They wouldn't say that in public, but philosophically speaking, they are very much Kaplanites for various reasons. In particular, the most important piece about God is that Kaplan rejects any kind of supernatural notions about God. God for Kaplan is very much a natural, a feature of nature, that God is this spirit that works through us and through nature. He's often referred to in Kaplan's work, God is referred to as the power that makes for salvation. That's the language that Kaplan works with, uses, where salvation is wholeness, shlemut, or shalom. He also uses the language, Kaplan also uses the language, God is the sum of the animating, organizing forces and relationships which are forever making a cosmos out of chaos. Okay, that is to say, the functioning of the whole world is made orderly by the presence of God. Okay, as this power that works through us. It is related to what is often referred to as process theology, for those of you who know that term. Let's read a little bit from, this is from his best known work, Kaplan's best known work, Judaism as Civilization. Pat, did you already read, right? Judith, would you be willing to read? You're next on my screen. Can you unmute? Oh.
Okay,
yeah,
here we go. Man has come to understand that the act of contemplating reality in its wholeness does not place him outside reality. He now realizes that the interrelatedness, which is the source of his awareness of Godhood, operates within him, no less than outside him. Thus is eliminated the very need of making any dichotomy either between the universe of man and the universe of God, or between the natural and the supernatural. There is only one universe within which both man and God exist.
And that universe, of course, is the universe in which God is working through all of us, is effectively a force within the universe, not an independent being. Okay, please keep going.
The so-called laws of nature represent the manner of God's immanent functioning. The element of creativity, which is not accounted for by the so-called laws of nature, and which points to the organic character of the universe or its life as a whole, gives us a clue to God's transcendent functioning. God is not an identifiable being who stands outside the universe. God is the life of the universe, immanent insofar as each part acts upon each other, and transcendent insofar as the whole acts upon each part.
Now, I must say that thank you for reading that. Personally, Kaplan has had a very strong impact on my own theology. He certainly was very impactful for Rabbi Neil Gilman, who studied with him, and Rabbi Gilman was one of my teachers at JTS. When Rabbi Gilman, who many of you know is his daughter Debbie belongs to Beth Shalom. When Rabbi Gilman taught a class on theology for rabbinical and cantorial students when I was at JTS, he required us to come up with a system of theology and describe it like a metaphor for theology, for how we understand God. And the metaphor that I came up with at the time, which I think is sort of related to the way that Kaplan understands the world, is that God functions something like the ideas behind the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which basically says that the more you know about the subatomic particle and its location, the less likely it is to be there. And that no matter how much we might learn, again, I'm a scientific person, I'm an engineer, the more that we understand about the universe, the more we are sort of confining God to these, what you might call interstitial spaces, these areas over which we have no idea exactly what's going on and we have no control over them. And that can only be where, in some cases, where God lives. So God is very much a part of us and a part of the universe and functioning in these ways that are still somewhat mysterious to us. And I think that works with Kaplan's understanding as God being a part of the universe and immanent, very much present in our world and being and working through us. Rather than independently. So let's hear. I've got another Kaplan piece over here. Again, I have found these texts to be very helpful. Here it is, Judaism and Civilization. Let's take a look at this. Going to get another. Let's see, Audrey, would you be willing to read? It is true, no doubt. Top of the page there.
It is true, no doubt, that in Judaism, the religious practices were for a long time interpreted as constituting the means of attaining a share in the world to come, or salvation. This conception of the religious practices operated as a powerfully motivating force in Jewish life, but it would never have succeeded in gaining its traditional importance in the Jewish consciousness if there had not already existed the need for self-identification with the Jewish people. That need met with fulfillment in the very practice of the mitzvot, apart from any end which they were regarded as serving. This fact renders the survival of Jewish civilization independent of the traditional belief in otherworldly salvation.
So what Kaplan is doing here is he's trying to explain where we are today by explaining where we have been. And as in this paragraph, what he's saying is that traditionally speaking, our relationship to God and our sense of how to achieve salvation was through the performance of mitzvot. Okay, and Kaplan loves this idea. When he talks about Judaism as civilization, he uses that terminology because civilization grows and changes and develops and reaches different stages. Kaplan loves to talk about stages. So at one stage, Kaplan talks about how the Jewish civilization needed the mitzvot for fulfillment. Okay. Now he's going to say, now today we have a different environment. He talks about, he's going to mention neo-Orthodox versus Reform. And of course, he's functioning in when he writes this, he's functioning in the conservative environment at JTS. By the way, as an aside, remember that Kaplan is very much considered by some to be a heretic. And in fact, when he published his first the Reconstruction of Sabbath Prayer book in 1945, he was not only placed in cherem excommunicated by the OU, the Union of Orthodox Congregations. But they also held, get this, a public book burning. They burned his Siddur in public because it was heresy. Okay, Audrey, why don't you continue reading here? The most important inference.
The most important inference to be drawn from the institutional approach relates to the manner of our response to the need for adjustment as Jews to the changed conditions of life. The neo-Orthodox Jew meets the challenge of the modern environment by a reaffirmation of his faith in tradition. He bases his veneration of the content of Judaism on the high authority of those from whom the content is derived. Their authority, in turn, it is assumed, is validated by the supernatural revelation of God's will.
For orthodoxy to function, it has to say, we're the original tradition. Our authority comes from Mount Sinai, from the revelation at Sinai. And so God is what God was then, and God will always be that way, and God will always expect us to fulfill the mitzvot. That is essentially orthodoxy. The dividing line, by the way, between, you might say, with respect to Torah, the dividing line between orthodoxy and non-orthodoxy is Torah miSinai, Torah from Sinai. To be Orthodox, you have to accept that God literally dictated the Torah to people on Mount Sinai. Now, there may be a few people in Orthodoxy today who are sort of questioning, to some extent, that statement, but that's essentially the dividing line. For non-Orthodox Jews, we don't have to accept Torah miSinai. We don't have to accept the traditional story as being absolute fact. We have other ways of understanding it. Please go on. The reformist.
The reformist Jew rejoices to find in Judaism truths of universal application, the unity of God, the brotherhood of man, the supremacy of righteousness. But for the Jew who approaches Judaism as a civilization, the test
i.e. he's saying, i.e. me, right? For the one who approaches Judaism as a civilization, go on.
The test for any form of adjustment will not be whether it conforms to the accepted teachings of revelation, nor whether it is consistent with the universal aims of mankind. His criterion will be, does that adjustment proceed from the essential nature of Judaism? Will it lead to the enrichment of the content of Judaism? Is it inherently interesting? The thing that makes Judaism a vital reality for him is not a regiment of conduct or a system of thought. He realizes that the force of a social heritage lies not in its abstract and universal values, but in its individuality, in its being unalterably itself and no other. This individuality he knows from within. It is an immediate and untransferable experience. It is as interesting to him as anything that is part of his own personality can be.
Okay, so ultimately what he's saying is that our deep cultural connection is not necessarily about Torah miSinai, about the God dictating the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai, or about per se the performance of mitzvot. It's about what is applicable to us and is interesting to us, and it will continue our tradition and allow us to carry on our heritage. Not about any particular historical set of values or what he calls folkways, the things that we do, but ultimately about those things that have value in this moment. There is some aspect of reform, the way that reform movement has unfolded itself. There's some crossover here, but you can't really call the Reconstructionists Reform Jews. They're very different. They're constructed quite differently. One of the principles that Kaplan lands on is that halakha, Jewish law, has a vote but not a veto. And it is very important for us to try to conserve certain aspects of Jewish tradition, but of course not be limited by the strict regimen that he talks about that Orthodoxy expects. Okay, so there's a little bit of Kaplan. Any thoughts or reactions to that in particular? I mean, I've got a little Heschel. We have about 10 minutes left. Was that a hand, Maddie? Were you going to say something? No, or Pat? Go ahead.
When he mentions something that's of interest to us, that seems like a pretty flimsy criterion.
Well, especially in this world where it's actually really hard to get people's attention at all about anything, because we're just so distracted by lots of stuff. I mean, look, remember, they're living in a very different world. Okay, they're living in a very different world, and so I don't know. It will be interesting to see I don't know, Pat, if you heard, I spoke about Rabbi Danny Schiff's book about Judaism in a digital age. I guess that was last Shabbat, or maybe two Shabbat, I don't remember. 2 Shabbatot ago. And you know, Rabbi Schiff does not. He sees the future as being somewhat bleak, not just for the Jews but for everybody. I hope that a philosopher will emerge that will be able to teach us how to handle Judaism in the coming years, but we haven't found that yet. I think that's nonetheless what. Yes, you're right. What is interesting to us is sort of flimsy and maybe not shall we say sustainable. Because our interests change. On the other hand, we have this very deep well of ideas and texts and traditions that we can continually draw from, right? And that won't change. How we apply them might very well change. I would say. I don't know if that's more helpful. So it's not just about what's interesting to us, but it's also interesting and drawn authentically from our tradition, I think, is how Kaplan would respond to that. Do we have any reconstructionists here? I don't know. Yes, Eileen, go ahead.
I'm not a reconstructionist, but I just want to go back to, well, actually, I'm not sure if I am. I might be visually, maybe, huh? Okay. It seems to me the element of, when they mentioned the element of creativity is outside of the natural, outside of the laws of nature. Okay. But is it strictly a property of God, who then doles it out to us? You know, I think, yeah, go ahead.
I think that's something that's very interesting about that creativity in particular. I think has to be seen as something that is a divine gift, something that we receive. You know, God did not create us as automatons or or just machines. Something, by the way, that again, whatever you might predict about the future of artificial intelligence or whatever, human beings will always be endowed with that divine creativity, which a machine will never be able to reproduce. At least I hope. I think that is something that we can see as being really what God gives us. And by the way, that plays out, of course, in what we do as Jews. If you think about, by the way, it's within the box, but chazanut, the creative musical interpretation of liturgy is a product of that creativity that flows from musical knowledge, and it flows from emancipation that allowed Jews to study at universities, to study music professionally, and so forth. And there have been many outgrowths that are sort of within the box. You could also have creativity that is sort of drawn from that goes pretty far outside the box of what we think of as normative Jewish practice or Orthodox Jewish practice. Pat, did you have something you want to add? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think it's interesting, Eileen, for you to, when you think about, you're an artist, so the way you think of creativity, it's interesting to tie that with the text. The text I understood to be saying that when God made the world, that was a creative act. I don't think of that as being a creative act and on the same continuum as, say, your artistic creativity, but it's an interesting idea.
I was just going to add here, I often, in my work, I've often used the metaphor of a crossword puzzle to explain creation. And I think of creation as a crossword puzzle with infinite parameters, where God is in the dark spaces between the clues. And we must keep all of these clues in mind in order to maintain our grasp of reality.
I think that's a nice understanding. Listen, we only have about 6 minutes left, which is not nearly enough time to capture everything that Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel ever wrote. But very briefly, I'm going to share. I'm just going to just share something because I think this is really essential. I won't give you Heschel's bio, but briefly, he's one of the most powerful speakers and writers and philosophers of the 20th century, not just for Jews, by the way, but he's inspiring also to others. The only concept that you need to know regarding Heschel and God, and Heschel wrote about a lot of things, is this idea of radical amazement. So I know Maddie's very excited about this. Why don't you read for us at the top of the page there? Okay, yes, thank you, Maddie, for showing us that you've got Heschel on your water bottle there.
On my water bottle, yep.
Yeah.
The two kinds of wonder.
Yeah.
Okay. Wonder or radical amazement is the chief characteristic of the religious man's attitude towards history and nature. One attitude is alien to his spirit, taking things for granted regarding events as a natural course of things. To find an approximate cause of a phenomenon is no answer to his ultimate wonder. He knows that there are laws that regulate the course of natural processes. He is aware of the regularity and pattern of things. However, such knowledge fails to mitigate his sense of perpetual surprise at the fact that there are facts at all. Looking at the world, he would say, "This is the Lord's doing, it is marvelous to our eyes."
So I think what Heschel is trying to say, and Heschel's prose is always kind of complicated and again somewhat ethereal. But his essential idea is that we react to God with this sense of radical amazement, that no matter how we try to define God or whatever, it's always insufficient, that we can only sort of ultimately we can spend a lot of time using sort of rational terms and trying to define God in various ways and pinning God into the interstitial spaces or the black spaces of the crossword or whatever, but ultimately we can all of those metaphors are insufficient, and we can only react by sort of throwing our hands up and saying, wow, radical amazement. Go on, read a little more, please.
That wonder is the feeling of a philosopher, and philosophy begins in wonder, was stated by Plato and maintained by Aristotle. For it is owing to their wonder that men both now begin and at first began to philosophize. Yeah. To this day, rational wonder is appreciated as semen scientiae, sorry.
Yeah.
As the seed of knowledge, as something conducive, not indigenous to cognition. Wonder is the prelude to knowledge. It ceases once the cause of a phenomenon is explained. Right.
Again, similar to that idea of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, when you know a lot about something, your wonder is gone. When you have insufficient knowledge, then that's where the wonder can creep in. That's where that sense of radical amazement can sort of guide us. Why don't you finish it up, and then we'll call it a day.
Right. But does the worth of wonder merely consist in its being a stimulant to the acquisition of knowledge? Is wonder the same as curiosity? To the prophets, wonder is a form of thinking. It is not the beginning of knowledge, but an act that goes beyond knowledge. It does not come to an end when knowledge is acquired. It is an attitude that never ceases. There is no answer in the world to man's radical amazement.
Right. So radical amazement is sort of this limitless reaction to God that we cannot help but have because of God's absolute complete unknowingness. No matter how much we try to pin God down through any kind of metaphor, it's always insufficient. There's a lot more that we could say about Heschel, and there's a lot more to read. If you want suggestions about what to read by Heschel, come see me. I'm happy to refer you. This was from God in Search of Man, but there's also Man Is Not Alone. There's also The Sabbath is a wonderful starting place, a little book that is really quite powerful. Anyway, I'm happy to point you in the right direction if you want to read more Heschel. But just by way of conclusion, let me say that this was our final session. We've covered a lot of ground. We've gone from the Tanakh to certainly the middle of the 20th century. We don't know what's coming next. I do know that for the Lunch and Learn next year, our theme is going to be the intersection of science and Judaism, and I hope to be featuring guests. We actually we've applied for actually a grant from an organization that gives out money for synagogues to talk about science and Judaism, and so we hope to have a series of speakers, of members of the congregation who work, and probably a capstone event, ideally with a special guest who we will be bringing in from outside as well to talk about the relationship of science and Judaism. So I just wanted to make you aware of that. Like I said, all of this material, I hope, was somewhat helpful to take a look at, some of the ways that God has been understood throughout our history. All of these videos, when this one will be available within the coming days, but all the other videos are up on the website if you want to go back and review some of the things we learned about all the characters we encountered from Jewish history and all the ways that we have to understand God. But as you can see, the most important message is that there are many, many different ways of understanding God. That we can't be limited to just what's found in the Tanakh, for example, just what's found in the Torah, but rather it is upon us, and this was something that my teacher, Rabbi Neil Gilman, taught us, which is that we have to find, as individuals, the understanding of God that works for us as individuals. That ultimately what will keep us connected is this searching for and ideally finding the metaphors that are, again, understanding that nothing is perfect, that all metaphors are imperfect, as I said in this sermon 2 weeks ago about Judaism, that was the one about God's gender. But all metaphors are imperfect. Nonetheless, they are valuable to us to help us find our way through our tradition. So I hope I've given you some things to think about. That was the whole point here. If you want to talk about God, about theology, I'm always happy to please set up an appointment. We'll come and talk about it. I would love to chat more with you further about it. And with that, sorry, got to end. Keep reading, keep studying, and be in touch. And I'll see you all soon. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all so much. Good to see you all. Take care, and looking forward to Pesach.
Thank you.
Starting all the chametz. All right, take care. Bye.
It was interesting.
Bye.